Welcome everybody to the second of the Strategic Defence Study Centre's War Study Seminars for this year. I'm Garth Bratton, the series convener and one of STC's historians. Before I go on, I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional custodians of land on which we meet, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. When we inaugurated STC's War Studies program many years ago, we determined that it should have an interdisciplinary focus and study the causes, conduct and consequences of war. Our speaker tonight, Professor Jessica Wolfendale, very much accords with this vision. Jessica is Professor of Philosophy at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio, although she hails from my hometown in Melbourne originally, who was visiting ANU as a guest of the International Relations Department. Among several research interests of Jessica's are military ethics and war crimes. So Jessica's presentation tonight will thus embrace both the conduct and the consequences of war, particularly as they affect civilians. These are timely and relevant topics given the terrible images and reports of civilian suffering reaching us from war zones like Gaza and Ukraine. So Jessica,
Thank you.
Floor is yours.
Thank you. So this microphone should be all good, right? I just plugged it.
That one, yeah.
Okay.
Should be.
So thanks for coming and thanks to Garth for organising this seminar. So this is a fairly new project of mine. So because it's fairly new, it's still in development, and so I actually welcome questions and feedback on it. And one of the things that motivated this paper is a workshop that was held actually here in December last year called Ethics, Experiences in War. And that's when I first started working on this. And one of the things I'm interested in this paper is looking at and unpacking how just war theory and military ethics has, really over, from its early days, prioritised and shown sort of normative concern for the moral and emotional well-being of combatants above or instead of the prioritisation or focus on civilian victims of war. So I'm interested in both the kind of origins of this focus on combatants' well-being and the costs of that focus in terms of how it affects civilians. So, okay, I get this slide to the, sorry. Okay, so I'm going to talk in sort of roughly 4 sections. I'm going to talk about what I call this idea of sort of the morally sensitive soldier, which I think is, again, is a focus of concern for early just war theory. Okay, no, I'm far away from my notes. Oh, okay. All right, I'll take a look in. Yeah, so this is a sort of image that I think emerges really from early just war theory and then is replicated both explicitly and implicitly throughout the different eras of the development of just war thinking and military ethics. Then I'm going to look at 2 cases where I think we see the cost of excluding civilian perspectives and the cost of the prioritisation of the welfare of combatants. And one is the case of drone warfare, the US drone warfare campaign, and understanding its collateral damage. And the second is in war crimes and autism. Third, I'm going to talk a little bit about what I think a civilian-focused ethics of war might look like. And then finally, I'm going to raise some kind of questions and concern that seem to me to be potential problems for my view and possible objections to my view and how I might think about responding to them. Are we good for feedback now? Is that
Still a bit distortion, but I
sound the mic's not working? Technical difficulties. Anything on these systems?
I think there often is a bit of feedback in this room.
Whoever that is sounds better.
That looks good.
Does that sound better? Is there any feedback?
The person to the left of the screen, who I don't think I know, sounds better. Anyway, go ahead, we can manage.
Okay.
Just quickly go here. Yeah, I think it should be Kodak. Like,
Okay, does that sound better?
keep talking.
Okay, I'll keep talking. Okay, so I'm going to talk first again about this idea of what I'm calling a morally sensitive soldier. Before I do that though, just a couple of terminological notes. When I talk about civilian perspectives, I'm using that phrase really as shorthand to encompass everything from first person testimony, witness statements, memoirs, to research on civilian experiences of war conducted by, for example, human rights organisations and NGOs. By ethics of war, I really mean both the just war tradition, military ethics, as well as political and military justifications for the use of force. So I recognise, of course, that there are people writing on war from a wide range of different disciplines and approaches. My focus here is specifically on this kind of background in the ethics of war, right? And the focus on, again, what I'm calling the morally sensitive soldier in that tradition. Okay, so what do I mean by the morally sensitive soldier? Well, and you'll have to forgive, this is a very bit of a sort of collection of three, I guess, case studies drawn from different points in history. And I think there's a lot more that can be said here, which I'm hoping to develop as I develop this project. But in very early just war theory, we see a concern, particularly with this Augustine's work, in trying to reconcile participation in war with Christian character. Right. So of course, naturally for St. Augustine and other early Christian just war theorists, their focus is very much on ensuring that soldiers have the right intention, have the right motives. So the focus for them is very much on the soldier's internal moral character and intentions. Right. So we see an early reference to the importance of, for early just war theorists, of soldiers' character. Right. And you don't see much mention of in these early accounts kind of any idea of course the idea of rights didn't really exist then, but the duties owed to civilians. The focus is very much on whether you can be a good Christian and fight in war. And then I'm jumping forward several centuries. Although I think I did originally have a little section on chivalry, which I think is also a movement where we see a focus very much on the character of the warrior and the warrior's honour in chivalrous accounts of warfare as well. But that's something I need to do a bit more research on. But when we come to colonialism, what we see here, I think, is really interesting. There's less of a direct reference to the character of soldiers and combatants, but there is an indirect emphasis on the importance and possibility of the civilized colonizer. So I think this comes up nicely in the affair of the Indies. So this was a series of debates sponsored by the Spanish Crown, partly as a result of reports of the extraordinary cruelty inflicted by Spanish conquistadors in South America after the early sort of discovery or invasion of South America. And so what these debates did was bring together, renowned thinkers of the day to debate the rights of Indigenous peoples, the rights of colonizers, and certainly some of the participants were very, very critical of the Spanish conquistadors. And some of the participants did defend Indigenous rights to sovereignty, at least to some degree. What I think is really interesting about this debate is that the very act of staging the debate at the time meant that the position of defending colonisation and the position of arguing for the possibility of a morally decent colonisation was given legitimacy by being part of this debate. And what I think also resulted from this debate is the way in which participants and the audience and people involved in that and the act of colonisation could align themselves with this theoretical possibility of morally decent colonisation, being a good coloniser as opposed to the bad conquistadors with their excessive behaviour. So that contrast between the sort of excesses of the bad conquistadors and the possibility of the morally decent coloniser enabled participating in the process of colonisation, but also framed it as something which was, again, consistent with good moral character. And this also comes out in other areas of colonisation where, and this is work from Kelly Oliver, who talks about this way in which, in defences of colonisation that were put forward by the Spanish and the British and other colonising forces, we see an emphasis on the idea that the colonising forces, including the colonising military forces, were members of the civilized, and as part of evidence of their civilization was both their possession of certain emotional states, but their ability to control their emotions, right? That their ability to have self-control is what mark them out as different from the supposedly savage barbaric natures with whom they were interacting. So again, you see this again indirect image of a kind of the morally sensitive soldier, the civilized soldier who can engage in colonizing warfare without losing their moral compass. And we know that they're morally decent because they're not sadists, they have emotions, right? But they can control them, right, in the exercise of colonizing power. This is again something which I think we'll unpack in more detail as I develop this project. But I think it's an interesting manifestation of, in a sense, this same concern with the moral and emotional well-being of the users of violence as opposed to the victims of violence in this context. So if we move on to a much more recent context, we see a similar concern and a similar almost praise for the moral well-being of perpetrators in Himmler's speeches to the SS during World War II. Right? So during the Holocaust, this is what he said to some of the SS officers, that, most of you know what it means when 100 corpses are lying side by side, to have stuck it out and at the same time, apart from exceptions caused by human weakness, to have remained decent fellows. That is what has made us hard. And in an additional quote, which I didn't put on the slide for reasons of space, he makes his point even more explicit. He says, he praises the SS for eradicating the Jewish people, quote, without our leaders and their men suffering any damage in their minds and souls. The danger was considerable, for there was only a narrow path between that, and forgive my pronunciation, Scylla, S-C-Y-L-L-A, Scylla, of their becoming heartless ruffians, unable any longer to treasure life, and I'm going to make this one too,
Charitas.
thank you, Charitas, of their becoming soft and suffering nervous breakdowns. So we have this image of the perpetrators of genocidal violence being praised for their capacity to retain moral sensitivity, right? But again, to control their emotions so they can carry out that violence, right? But without becoming, they're not soft and weak, they can do it, but they're also not heartless ruffians. So it's a little bit like this sort of idea of the morally decent colonizer that emerges from the affair of the Indies. Although in that case that was implicit, and here it's explicit, right? And it's also something that we are invited to admire in the SS, that they were able, according to Himmler, to engage in these acts of violence, yet still be good, decent fellows, still retain their, still not suffer any damage in their hearts and minds, as he says. So what I'm doing here is sort of just unpacking what I think are kind of representative examples of this sort of focus, both again in military ethics, in just war theory, when you see it, for example, in the debates on the affair of the Indies, but also in the practices and narratives that are given for the justification of different forms of military violence, in Himmler's speeches to the SS. And in contemporary military ethics, you also see this focus on the character and moral and emotional well-being of military personnel as being central. So David Lubin, for example, says that warrior's honour remains a central concept of military ethics as militaries understand it. Military forces, and this is I think true at least in Australia and America, focus very much, for example, on virtue ethics and character ethics in military ethics education. It also comes out in the moral injury literature, which I don't know whether you're familiar with this literature very in any detail, but to put very simply, I can certainly expand more in question time. Moral injury in the military ethics space refers to feelings of shame or guilt experienced by combatants and veterans in relation to the military service, often in relation to either perceived transgressions or actual transgressions that they've committed, or in some accounts as a response to feelings of betrayal from the chain of command. But this literature, which is pretty extensive at this point, emerges from military psychology. It pretty much exclusively focuses on the moral emotions of combatants. So one of the authors who's written about this literature is Rosemary Kellison, and she says in her discussion of the American moral injury literature that non-combatants are just not recognised at all as being, as she puts it, potentially morally injured subjects, even though non-combatants in wartime will often witness transgressions, might commit transgressions, might be betrayed. They might experience very much similar kinds of things as combatants, but they're basically invisible in literature entirely. Where she points out, when they do turn up, it's usually in the context of a victim of some transgression which then causes moral injury to the combatant involved. Right? So even if they do appear, it's as, in a sense, the source of moral injury for the combatant. So I think what we see with the moral injury literature is a kind of continuation of this really long-standing focus and concern, prioritization of combatants' emotional and moral well-being, and the almost complete absence of similar concern for the emotional and moral well-being of non-combatants and civilians. So it's worth asking though, why is this the case? And I should say, one of the things I'm not saying is that it's wrong for military ethics to be concerned with combatants' well-being. That's certainly not what I'm claiming. There are very good reasons for military ethics or just war theorists to be concerned with combatants' well-being. What I'm focusing on is the prioritization of that concern and the exclusion of similar concern for non-combatants in war. And there's good reasons to think that, there's some value in the idea of the morally sensitive soldier and the concern for combatants' moral well-being. I mean, first and foremost, this goes back to St. Augustine, it enables to become possible to reconcile fighting in war, committing acts of violence, with retaining a morally decent character, right? And that's obviously extremely important both at the level of military institutions. It's clearly important in terms of motivating people to fight, justifying warfare, legitimizing warfare, that you can show that warfare, fighting war is compatible with being a morally good person. But it's also important at the individual level as providing resources for the individual combatant to make sense of their own military service in a way that coheres with their self-image as a good person. So my point is not to say those are bad motivations. They're not, right? They're very human motivations, and they might be essential motivations if we are to have military forces at all. But there are serious concerns, though, with the cost of this kind of prioritization. So first, for example, I think that, and I think this really comes out in moral injury literature, it can divert attention away from important questions about the morality of war, the morality of specific armed conflicts, right? So, for example, in the moral injury literature, the focus is often on diagnosing moral injury in an individual combatant and then treating it. But, and I'm not the only person who's made this critique. Kellison also makes a critique, and Robert Marr, I don't know how to pronounce his last name, MEAGHER. He also raises this concern, which is that the kind of hyper-individualized focus of much moral injury literature ignores how soldiers' moral emotions related to conflict raise hard moral questions about the conflicts, right? Not just about what they did, but about whether the conflict as a whole was morally legitimate. But if the focus is just on thinking of it in terms of a kind of individual injury that needs treatment, that critique aspect of soldiers' moral emotions gets conveniently kind of sidelined. Right? So that's one issue with the sort of focus on combatants' moral and emotional well-being, is that it kind of individualizes war in a way that can divert, unintentionally or intentionally, attention away from harder questions about whether a particular war is in fact justified. Another point, I have to thank Keto Driscoll for raising this question, is that even though I use this language of concern for soldiers' moral and emotional well-being, it's a really fair question to ask whether this way of thinking about war, for these attempts to reconcile war fighting with moral character, are actually in soldiers' best interests. Like whether they do in fact protect or sustain soldiers' moral and emotional well-being. So, for example, the way Himmler talked about participation in genocide is something which was almost something to be proud of if you could do it in a way that didn't make you a ruffian. It's pretty clear that under any plausible conception of moral flourishing, that's not the conception of moral flourishing that we want to endorse, right? That being able to commit genocide while feeling kind of good about yourself is a pretty problematic idea of moral flourishing. So it's not even necessarily true that the way in which this concern for soldiers' well-being manifests in specific cases is actually really in the service of soldiers' well-being. But in fact, and I think this is in some ways the more fundamental issue, there are significant and measurable costs on civilians of this prioritization of soldiers' emotional well-being in the ethics of war literature that I'm focusing on. So now I'm going to turn to the two case studies I'm interested in to illustrate this point. So first I'll talk about drone warfare, and then I'll talk about war crimes apologism. So by drone warfare, I'm talking here about the US drone campaign, which has now been ongoing for over 20 years. And I just don't know what's going to happen with the Trump administration, but I can feel pretty confident in saying it's not going to lessen. If anything, it's probably going to expand. We've already seen the Trump administration order lethal strikes on civilian vessels. So, yeah. But research on the impact of drone warfare and surveillance dating back to the 2010s, as well as first-person testimony, shows that the impact of drone warfare and surveillance is devastating. This is leaving aside the very important question of the number of civilians who have been killed and wounded in drone strikes. And many scholars have pointed out there have been serious issues in the US case in terms of accountability, in terms of underreporting and undercounting of civilians killed. But in addition to that harm, the act of drone surveillance itself, when it's linked to a campaign of drone strikes, causes extraordinary psychological trauma to the entire community under surveillance, not just any specific targets who might know their targets or not. So this is very well documented in the Stanford Law Center's report on living on drones. There's also Columbia Law School issued a report on this. There is substantive evidence about this. I can give you a small quote, and certainly I can go to the more detail in Q&A, given that I'm already a little bit slower than I thought it was going to be. So one psychologist who was working in Yemen reported that, quote, most of the people he surveyed manifested clinical levels of PTSD symptoms. Children were particularly affected and reported nightmares of dead people, fear of going to sleep, and fears they will be harmed by drones. There's also the ongoing harm of displacement, destruction of community. Many communities are not able to engage in important community rituals such as funerals and weddings because large gatherings can sometimes trigger attention and possible drone strikes. There's also the plausible case that moral harm is inflicted. Kellison actually makes this argument. She thinks we should call this a form of moral injury. When, for example, and this is according to the Stanford report, living under drones, often victims of communities won't know why certain communities are targeted. They don't have access to targeting criteria or decision making. So if a strike occurs, and this is a quote from the report, there is no one to recognise, apologise for, or explain their sorrow. There is no one to hold accountable for their fear. So I think it's plausible to describe that as a moral injustice or a moral harm. I should say that inability to seek accountability, inability to know why one was attacked and why one's suffering is occurring. But the problem is, and there are many things one can say about how this information about the impact of drone warfare should factor into the ethics of war literature. Here I'm just going to focus on one relevant, I think, implication, which is in how it should impact collateral damage estimates. So typically, most militaries and international law, collateral damage typically only includes deaths, injuries, and harms to civilian structures. Right? And that's what's used in most military forces as well. Yet, so collateral damage estimates do not include the kinds of harms I just talked about. They don't include psychological harm. They don't include the harm of displacement, destruction of community, and moral harm. Now, if we just talk about psychological harm, right? Because obviously there are questions about how do you operationalize something like moral harm and a collateral damage estimate. I'm going to leave that aside for now and just focus on the case of PTSD. Right? So there are a number of scholars who have made the argument that, look, there really is no good reason for excluding psychological harm from collateral damage estimates, particularly since there are actually well-developed and well-researched measures for evaluating and predicting PTSD rates for victims of different kinds of trauma. So you can, ahead of time now, effectively estimate the number of people who will suffer PTSD from different kinds of experiences of violence. Right? And given that, existing collateral damage estimates are already going to be inexact by necessity, they're never going to be a perfect prediction of the numbers of deaths, injuries, or damages to civilian structures. The measures used for predicting PTSD are probably at least as good in terms of giving workable estimates of the degree of harm that might be inflicted. So, and again, we have decades now of knowledge about the psychological harm inflicted by drone warfare. So, and this is from Smuckley et al.'s paper on this, they argue there are compelling reasons to include mental harm proportionality analysis. And this is particularly true given that the military spent significant resources and time evaluating and studying PTSD in combatants. So again, this is another illustration of the broader point I'm making about the emphasis on and the prioritization of combatants' emotional and moral well-being. So again, this is just one illustration of how including a better understanding of civilian harm would have a measurable impact and should have a measurable impact on, in this case, collateral damage estimates and really military ethics more broadly. In the paper, I talked a little bit about how a fair number of scholars of drones often focus on the impact of drone warfare on the drone operators, rather than, again, on the victims of drones. So that's another area which I think there's insufficient attention being paid to civilian victims. Okay, the second case that I want to look at is the impact of the prioritization of combatants' emotional and moral well-being in relation to war crimes. So you can think of the drone warfare case as a situation where the failure to seek out or recognize or address civilian experiences leads to a really extraordinary degree of collateral or incidental harm. In the case of war crimes, we're talking about deliberately inflicted violence against civilians. And the examples that we're giving here are a certain kind of apologist narrative that often accompanies alleged war crimes, particularly committed by members of armed forces in liberal democracies. So in response to the alleged SASR war crimes that were documented in the Brereton report, here are a couple of illustrative quotes which sort of capture the kind of apologism that I'm focusing on. So Tony Abbott said, "We shouldn't judge soldiers operating in the heat of combat under the fog of war by the same standards that we judge civilians." Alexander Downer, "You put the army into these situations, not aid workers. I can understand how they might be a little trigger happy. Don't send the SASR in if you're worried you're going to kill someone. Of course, they're going to kill someone." And then my favorite, John Singleton's ad, an apology to Ben Roberts-Smith from a coward, which appeared in, I can't remember what he's now. It's a full page ad he wrote. This is just an excerpt from it. "We, the great majority, envy your courage, strength, commitment, and the torture you must now endure. We are in your debt. In that awful moment, the soldier has to react. Someone has to pull the trigger, kill or be killed." So, what these kinds of narratives do is encourage the audience to, again, sympathize with the user of violence. The alleged perpetrator of war crimes here is held up as a figure we should either excuse because of the hell of war, or we should sympathize with. In John Singleton's ad, we're invited to think of the torture that Ben Roberts-Smith suffered. Not the harm that he allegedly inflicted on his victims, but the how difficult it must have been for him. Right. So again, we're very much encouraged in this way of framing these alleged war crimes to think of the perpetrators or alleged perpetrators in a sympathetic, excusing light. So the victims just don't appear at all in these narratives. We're not invited to consider the impact of the alleged crimes on the victims. And it's often also forgotten that the victims, and this is documented in the Brereton report, reports from civilians in the area of these alleged war crimes were typically ignored at the time or dismissed as Taliban propaganda. Right. So this ignoring or dismissing or deprioritizing the concerns of civilians in favour of upholding images of Australian soldiers as decent and honourable really began at that time, at least according to what's alleged in the Brereton report. America has its own share of this kind of apologism. So after the 2015 Senate report documenting the CIA's torture and interrogation program, Barack Obama defended his administration's decision to hold no one accountable for anything, obviously not fair, in this ways. He says, people did not know whether more attacks were imminent. There was enormous pressure on our law enforcement, national security teams. It's important for us not to feel too sanctimonious in retrospect about the tough job these folks had. A lot of these folks were working hard under enormous pressure and are real patriots. So here we see, again, a direct plea for the audience to be sympathetic to the perpetrators of torture. In this case, the architects of the torture program, the perpetrators of torture are portrayed as, again, they were only doing what they thought was right. They're real patriots, and our sympathies should lie with them. And we should be concerned with their welfare, not the welfare of the thousands of people who were tortured as part of that program. So this is another kind of illustration of this sort of perpetrator-focused narratives of war crimes that have accompanied documented war crimes and alleged war crimes in both Australia and the US. And they share this, the commonalities across this kind of apologism is very much it's the perpetrator's welfare we should be concerned with, right? They're the ones, they're morally decent, they thought they were doing the right thing, they were overcome by the hell of war. Maybe they suffered torture, they're the ones we should worry about. So, if I think about the costs of this, so what are the costs of excluding civilian perspectives? In just war theory, in military ethics, in military policy decision making. I think, at the level of sort of theory, once you practice too, one of the significant costs is a failure to appreciate and understand the full moral dimensions of armed conflict. Right? War is, and again, my point is not that we shouldn't be concerned at all with the welfare of soldiers. We absolutely should. The point is, by not taking into account, deliberately or otherwise, or just by negligence, not taking into account how armed conflict affects civilians, we're missing really half of the normative picture, at least half. And by failing to take into account civilian perspectives, we're failing to protect the most vulnerable in war. There's really an argument not just for taking into account civilian perspectives, but prioritising them, given that civilians and non-combatants are the most vulnerable in war, right? Which is, again, not to say that combatants are not also vulnerable, but it feels like the moral imbalance is wrong at the moment. To understand the moral dimensions of war, we need to understand how it affects everybody who's involved in it. A clear implication of excluding civilian perspectives in the context of war crimes is, certainly as we saw in the US case, remains to be seen what happens in the Australian case, a failure to hold war crimes perpetrators accountable. Right? These narratives are very effective in diffusing public and political demand for accountability. And this is related to then the infliction of ongoing injustice on the victims of war and the victims of war crimes. Right? So, for example, in the case of drone warfare, when military planners, military ethicists fail to take into account psychological trauma in proportionality calculations, despite that data being readily available now for over a decade, this is, I think, an infliction of injustice. And finally, it leads, I think, to the toleration of extreme harm and suffering on civilians. Right? And that's an ongoing, something which we can manifestly see as ongoing in today's conflicts. So what would a civilian-focused ethics of war look like? So here again, this is, again, fairly, I'm sketching out an outline of what I think this might evolve to. First of all, I think there's actually a moral obligation on the part of military ethicists, policymakers, decision makers, political leaders to prioritise civilian perspectives, for example, in assessments of new military technology. So again, debates about drones is a good example, debates about AI and weaponry is a good example. The first and foremost question should be, what will this do to the people who are going to be injured by it? Right? Because again, it's a truism of war that civilians will inevitably be harmed. So if there are new weapons being proposed, then we have to ask, well, how will these harm people? What kind of harms will they cause? Can those harms be outweighed by whatever possible good these weapons might be used for? So this should factor into proportionality and collateral damage calculations. Prioritising civilian perspectives is crucial in judgments and discussions and reporting of responsibility for war crimes. So I've been really disturbed by, again, the failure of a lot of not all of it, but a lot of reporting and discussions of the alleged Australian war crimes, that the victims just seem to disappear from the debate. There's a very good op-ed in ABC Religion and Ethics that just came out today from Christopher Ellett and Neil Reddick, talking about the Australian War Memorial's failure to really mention very much at all about the allegations against Ben Robert Smith in the 2 displays I have related to him. One in the Hall of Valor, and the other one's in the display in Afghanistan. So there's another, I think, implication that this is going to have implications for how military memorialisation should proceed. And finally, I think it's crucial to have the inclusion of civilian perspectives in military ethics education. Right? So if you're looking at case studies of war crimes, if you're looking at potential ethical dilemmas, bring in people who can testify, or researchers who have worked on and with civilians who've experienced these kinds of case studies. Right? Give military personnel an understanding of what it's like to suffer from these forms of violence in war. Not with the view of necessarily therefore saying that it's all unjustified, but again, give a full moral dimension of what participation in war involves. So I'm just going to end with some questions I've come up with, which I think are challenges to my view, potential challenges. So just in the interest of time, I think I might leave them up there, and then depending on your questions, I can come back to them and answer them in more detail. But at this point, I think I'll open up to questions from you all.